complete. There we are. Perfect. We have everybody on here. This is great. And so let me just start off. I'm David Chambers. I'm Deputy Director for Implementation Science at the National Cancer Institute. And I was asked to chair this panel, which is really focusing on sustainability of our data sharing practices. And when I was asked, the notion was that implementation science, which is the area that I oversee at the NCI, might be a relevant lens to think a little bit about data sharing of our clinical trials. And so what you see here at the bottom is this, there in larger form, a couple of graphics that just help to give a brief intro to folks who are less familiar with implementation science about what are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So the left, which comes from a paper we did back in 2009, tries to draw that contrast between what we're typically looking at in a clinical trial. What is it that we try and provide to a patient to yield all the way on the right at some health outcomes, where implementation science is trying to move from the what to think about how. How do we make sure that our discoveries, that our data are taken up so that they can have maximal use? And so some of the implementation outcomes that we think about are the feasibility, in this case, of using the data, the acceptability, sustainability, which of course is going to be key to our discussion here today, the costs associated with it, and the degree of uptake that we want to try and achieve so that our valuable resources, the data, can be as useful as possible. On the right, this particular graphic comes from our National Cancer Institute annual plan from 2021, which again sort of tries to briefly talk about implementation science as a range of different innovations that we're trying to get used. They're sometimes underused, sometimes there may be innovations that are overused, but we're trying to get to optimal use of our discoveries that can be affected at every level of our system. And so importantly, that we don't just think on day one of how can we make our discoveries as useful and available, accessible as possible, but how can we sustain that use over time? So just to set up that our discussion is really concentrating on that sustained use of data sharing, and we have these three wonderful experts who are joining us, who I have the pleasure of being able to ask questions and listen to. So those three panelists are, and you'll see the slides associated with them as we move along. As we're introducing, those are first Dr. Frank Rockhold, Professor of Biostats and Bioinformatics at Duke University Medical Center, who brings together joint perspective around academic and industry experience. Then following our second panelist, you'll see a smiling face as well, Jamie Guidry-Auville from the National Cancer Institute as well, the director of the Office of Data Sharing. And then our third panelist is Yili Pritchett, Vice President, Head of Biometrics at G1 Therapeutics, again, bringing a solid experience, expertise from industry. And so thank you all for joining us. And just to kick things off, wanted to give each of you an opportunity to discuss a bit around the inspiration or the motivation of the organizations that you work with for clinical trials data sharing. So a way in which we can kind of set the context in which your experience around clinical trials data sharing have occurred. So Yili, can we start with you and just give us the initial perspective, your context that we're going to set as part of the larger conversation, and then we'll go next to Frank and then to Jamie.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here. And actually, it's our honor to present our G1 experience at this symposium. So talk about our experience. What we did is reasonably simple. Last year, we sent our first 3 data sets to PDS. So very simple statements, right? But behind that was lots of work. That was first time for our company, including myself, 20-some years in industry, doing such a thing. So how to start this? G1 senior management got contact from PDS, and then we immediately realized the importance of sharing data. There's no argument about this. So really, we heard today again is to optimize the value resigned in clinical trial data, right? But for us, as biostatisticians, being a trained PhD statistician in this field, working on many new drug developments, I see this is my contribution, not just doing new drug development, send new compounds to patients' hand to help them, to treat them, right? But also we can make our data to be used by others researchers to dig out more values. And we also doing our clinical trials, we really benefit from those publications. For example, when we need to design clinical trial, worried about confounding factors, worried about prognostic factors for survival outcome, what did we do? We researched papers, right? Research the relevant patient population, find the answer, put it into our design. So we benefit from those researches, those publications. So with that being said, our team signed on this project. No negotiation. We just put on the timeline, right? We last year we were on NDA, G1 teams on NDA, and then so we put on after NDA. We said we picked up whenever NDA packages some to FDA, we pick this up, and then we did. It was not that simple because no one did something called the de-identification, which you from surface you thought it's simple. Take out patient ID, you are done. No, it's not that simple, right? The point is you need to worry about some patients' information can be easily identified through the database, although that was the purpose for sharing. But just worry, right? Someone uses data to find the patient information. So that's our responsibility to protect patient privacy. So we read the guidance carefully. That's our first step, read the guidance very carefully, and then come up with a plan called a de-identification plan. We have a plan, just like ASAP. We have a plan. So going through those patient-related variables, we define on this high risk, medium risk, low risk for relieving patient information. So take care for how to deal with them. The mega plan. Once this plan being created, has internal review, and then we apply to studies using SaaS programs to deal with those possible issues. And then lastly, we not just send out data, we ask for validation. We ask independent eyes, independent statistician doing validation to make sure that person couldn't find any information could be related to patient. So that's how we did.
Great. Thanks so much for setting the context. Frank, similar question for you, the sort of inspiration, motivation around clinical trials data sharing.
So thank you very much. I've been fortunate to be involved in data sharing initiatives for over 20 years. And so that the perspective is interesting. That hard to come up with new ideas after all the great speakers ahead of me, but I might say some things that are maybe a little bit different. I've been doing this a long time. was fortunate enough to work for an organization, GlaxoSmithKline, that was committed to data sharing. So in 2004, we put all the results of all 5,000 clinical trials at GSK on the company website before the CT.gov was up and running. We put all the IPD in 2013. I helped start CSDR, did work with PDS, worked with Bibli, run the SOAR system at Duke. As Steve said, part of ICODA and the Clinical Research Data Alliance that Bill said Duke's a founding member of that, and I sat on the CDIS board for 10 years. So all the relevance of that is there's a bit of Groundhog Day that's going on. I mean, a lot of these issues have come up before. I think, as Rob said, in 2005, the pharma industry was convinced the world was going to come to an end if we had to register clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, and it was going to destroy the entire commercial alliance. So the motivation under all that, so it is, and it's already been said, that the patients, and if I focus on clinical trials for the moment, patients absolutely want their data shared. That's been shown many, many times. Future patients want the patients from clinical trials data shared for their own purposes. And I think a tool I saw put in the chat, an important comment about people need to stop using the word ownership. It's a shared enterprise. And I think one of the things that also motivates around data sharing, whether you're in academia or in the pharmaceutical industry, is what's actually important to share is your failures. And I think Steve Kern or somebody actually alluded to this. If something's not going to work, or a target's not going to work, or a method's not going to work, everybody needs to know that, so we don't waste money and resources reinvesting in the same problem. I think the idea of disclosure, there's a lot of technical terms about whether or not access or sharing is important, or transparency versus disclosure. But I think one thing is important is around data stewardship. I think it was might have been the last in-person meeting I went to in December of 2019. IOM Jeff Drazen hosted the meeting, and he closed the meeting, I think, with something I haven't forgotten. He said, "You know what? Data sharing is important, and it's really for all the reasons that have been discussed today." But he said, actually, if nothing ever comes out of data sharing, if we actually have better data stewardship and take better care of our data, the world will be a better place. That's how he closed the meeting. Just a few other comments to follow up on yesterday. Actually, there was an editorial in Nature Medicine. I don't know if you saw it, about over the ivermectin controversy that Rob alluded to, and had all the individual patient data been in the public domain immediately after the trials, a lot of the controversy that exists today might have been diminished. And I want to comment a couple of things that came up in the last session. I think the rogue analysis thing is overblown, in my opinion. I mean, I've been watching this space for a long time, and people have published a paper on this. People have done really dumb analyses looking only at overall results or combining publications. They don't need individual patient data to do something stupid. So, and I think we've also shown in the last year, plenty of people have done improper and rogue analyses when they're the primary researcher. They don't need to be the secondary researcher. So I really think that using that as a reason to worry about sharing data, I think personally, I think is overemphasized. There also it was discussed earlier, the pull versus the push. One of the problems we have is that a lot of the people who want data don't overlap with the people who are providing data. So there isn't a lot of shared knowledge and shared interest, and that does affect uptake. I think Steve referred to ICOTA, where they chose to go after results first instead of individual patient data for that reason, because it was easier to get information into the public domain. The other comment I want to make is that, and it relates to something, combination of what Harlan and Bill Lube said at the beginning, the different platforms have different filters for how you can access data, and this does affect the sustainability piece. I would share an IRP that's supposed to determine the scientific validity of the proposals, and I've really grown to believe that I don't know that any one group or platform can decide what is or isn't good science. And I think the idea that with PDS has a much coarser filter around whether or not you can get access to the data. And I think that, and the combination of downloading, my personal opinion, but what I've seen over the last 15 years, will actually lead to more uptake. And the more uptake you have, the more pull you'll get. And then I think sustainability will help. No doubt, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, funding is an issue, right? So yes, there are policies that say you should share data. I think the Corey gives you money to do it. Gates Foundation gives you money to do it. Not sure every other funding agency has actually stepped up to the plate there. So I think that is certainly a limiting factor. But I'll stop there and we can continue in the discussion.
Yeah, thanks for the introductory comments, and as well as reflecting on prior discussions here today. So, Jamie, same question for you: the inspiration, motivation of your organization around clinical trial data sharing.
Yes, thank you, David, and thank you to the previous panelists. There's been really good discussion today, and a lot to think about. So, representing the government alongside David here, we are public servants, and so the motivation for our organization really is the benefit of the public. And the federal government has really in recent years been increasingly moving towards supporting and enhancing data sharing efforts that would benefit the greater public good, particularly when efforts are being funded with government dollars. And in large part, at least from policy perspective, a lot of that push was started back during the Obama administration with a memo that John Holdren had put out from the Office of Science and Technology Policy that really was pushing that need to have government funded efforts really making their data available, at least digitally, and really helping to advance the greater public good. And so since that time, NIH has developed quite a number of policies that really are pushing that envelope and trying to move toward more what you'll hear these terms often, free, broad, and easy access and availability to the wider research community. And that includes policies like our genomic data sharing policy within NCI, that includes our cancer moonshot policy more recently. And of course, very relevant to this group is NIH's policy on dissemination of NIH-funded clinical trial information, which really is set to establish expectations that any of our NIH-funded awardees and investigators that would be conducting clinical trials, whether they're funded in whole or in part by the NIH, really do need, as was mentioned, to register and submit at least summary result information to clinicaltrials.gov for public posting. And to that end, and to the sustainability we'll talk about today, I think along with that effort, NIH has at least really tried to launch a series of initiatives and resources that can enhance its stewardship over that clinical trials data, and trying to specifically focus on the accountability and transparency of the clinical research that we're funding. And looking at the clinical trial life cycle and what that means, I think that data sharing, what we have to cover when we talk about sustainability, is not only the sharing itself, but what leads to the sharing. How can we help all throughout the process, as was mentioned, not only the funding for it, but having tools and templates and expectations to set up how we outline the clinical trials, what's expected to be captured throughout them, what's going to be the most useful to share, and then providing ways to share that data. So not just saying, as was mentioned, that we have to do it, but actually sort of putting our money where our mouth is and presenting ways to share that data. And to that end, we're always continuing to add to what we'll call our research data ecosystem at NCI, and NIH more broadly has many data repositories. One such from the NCI does include the NCTN, National Clinical Trials Network Archive, that shares at least phase 3 studies. But as I think was heard earlier in some comments, we certainly know that there are more data that exists, and we need to be working toward getting other types of data in that are associated with these trials and possibly earlier trials. And we also have additional data repositories, and I think this sort of speaks to what Rob was mentioning earlier, collecting multiple types of data and really bringing that in, not only for individual decision making, but for relating back out to the population, and certainly doing that over time. And so we also have our cancer research data commons that to date holds genomics, imaging, and proteomics data that has been generated on biospecimens that were hailing from NCI-supported clinical trials that include our match trials and others like pediatrics. And they include tools to visualize that data, integrate that data, because I think what's also been mentioned is that we need to be able to use the data. Just making it available isn't enough. The data utility is really important to focus on. And that's something certainly at NCI that I think we've been really focused on in the last few years through certain large scale data sharing initiatives, really enriching those reference data sets to make that data more useful, more impactful for ultimately the patients, but also the researchers and investigators that are trying to come up with those answers along the way. I mentioned the Cancer Moonshot. Many of those projects are really aimed at enhancing that type of large scale sharing. Our Childhood Cancer Data Initiative is building upon that idea, but largely again focused on the need to develop and maintain repositories and tools that can be integrated, that can work together to analyze those data sets, in addition to simply making them available so they're useful. And that's just a quick example. My first foray into this type of data sharing really began when I came to NCI. I was leading NCI's Target Initiative. It stands for Therapeutically Applicable Research to Generate Effective Treatments. And it really was a pediatric version of the Cancer Genome Atlas. And really that was characterizing tumors, matched germline samples with various types of DNA or RNA sequencing in sort of a cooperative structure. And although that effort was omics based and for research, all of the samples, at least for Target, were characterized from bank tissues obtained from participants that were enrolled on clinical and biology trials run out of the Children's Oncology Group. And being able to use those samples for research and then also obtain their clinical data and data from trials that they had been that they had participated in. We had all of that data and outcomes data, and that has just led to revolutionary discoveries, to novel therapeutic approaches that have been employed in subsequent COG trials for patients, multiple publications, all of which actually happened in a relatively short amount of time in the grand scheme of things. And that experience has really helped to shape my view of what's possible to do with greater access to really high quality patient level data to really move that research and innovation further, not just that old ideal of replicating what has already been done, although that's important. So for me, data sharing, in addition to being told we have to do it from the public's perspective, it's really become a passionate ideal within our work within the Office of Data Sharing to help create that baseline of information for as many individuals as we can collectively to really be able to help patients find more treatments and cures that would work for them individually, which is that caveat of working toward precision medicine.
Great. Thanks. Thanks to each of you for those introductory comments. Thanks also to folks in the chat who are already putting in questions that we'll try and swiftly get to. We're not too far away from the rapid response round. But one of the questions that often pops up is, to what end are we thinking about data sharing? And I would love to have quick thoughts from Frank and then Jamie and then Yili, how you define success. So what is the success of data sharing efforts, particularly over time, that you can share with us? Frank?
That's a great question. There's always the so what, why are we doing this, and where's the proof of value? And I guess I've just learned to believe if you do what you think is the best for the patient, and they continue to request that and pull for it, to me, and you get that message to them, that's successful. But I do view it as a journey, and there's not an end to this. So it's we need to make progress. I think as was pointed out earlier, we continue to make progress. We've made progress, a lot of progress in trials, as Rob pointed out. We need to make progress with larger amounts of information. So I think success is forward movement. I think success is also, as Jeff Drazen put it, as I alluded to, is we just need to take better care of our data. And I think that if this helps us do that better and treat it truly as an asset that's going to be publicly available, but it's still an asset.
Great. Thanks. Jamie?
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, being able to see the impact on the patient, I know we've heard that multiple times today, but I think that really is sort of the ultimate goal. And while we're in healthcare or research is really to benefit that population. And so making sure that there is an impact and is a value. And on the flip side, I come from the research side. So also being able to benefit the science and the learning portion of this. So yes, we do need to make an impact on the patients, but we do also need to increase our knowledge base. And so being able to see things like the increased publications or novel therapeutics, that impact being felt by each individual stakeholder, I think can't be underestimated. I think if we're going to take the time to do data sharing and do it right, that it should have a ripple effect and multiple benefits. And so hopefully it really helps to bring together the whole enterprise.
Great, thanks. Yili?
I think if we know we share the data, researchers dig up lots of information, put in publication, which will in turn support future clinical trial design, help patient treatments options. I think, to me, that's a great reward. To me, that's the definition we would work toward.
Great. Thank you for that. So one of the things that's already come up as we think about sustainment are the costs associated with it. So just from each of your perspectives, why don't we start with Jamie and then Yili and then Frank? What resources, as you see it, are needed in order to sustain data sharing?
That's a great question. And one is a funder that we get very often. But truly, I think that data sharing done correctly is a very resource heavy endeavor. And that's not just from the financial cost, but really from the time and the expertise really needed to put into the data sets, to formatting, to abiding by certain standards, is costly from all fronts. And so we really have to think about how we're setting up our repositories that are going to store and maintain the data, how we are going to establish appropriate interfaces to access and integrate the data, understand it, tools to analyze and interpret it in meaningful ways. So being able to put forth the resources for the investigator and or an institution to be able to format and come up with that data before submission, but as well as on the flip side, the data sharing costs that are required for setting up repositories, and even the tools that NIH has put in place just to walk applicants through a consistent process for submitting to funding for clinical trials is very costly. But I really would state that I think the investment is the juice is worth the squeeze. So if we invest in the proper infrastructure to do that, I really do think that over time we reap the rewards of doing that, because when we approach this as individual data sets or individual groups, individual repositories for every single instance, instead of sort of coming together and creating an infrastructure that is much more user-friendly and well thought out to begin with, we can save on the back end. But I think there's no doubt that it's certainly a costly endeavor, certainly upfront and for maintenance.
Thanks. Yuli?
Yeah, I think it takes lots of programming efforts. In G1, we are very fortunate. We have a fabulous statistical program team. So that team actually delivered our data, which was sent to PDS. Lots of work, right, to understand the patient de-identification strategy, build our own plan. For example, you want to merge the patient age into categories. You don't want to share patient individual age. Then how to merge them? What's the best way to merge? It's not by theory from 18 to 25, something like that. You run data frequency, understand our data, right? You check clinical trial, collect different data. So we run lots of frequency, understand the scope of the data, and then decide on how to make them de-identified format. So that's a programming effort. So I want to say, if we change our mindset in industry, we know our job to do any clinical trials, our job is not end by deliver the results, right? Write down CSR, write down NDA package to FDA, get the drug approved. Our job include this part, share data to the public domain to support the community, support the research. Then we can plan our resource upfront to support this effort.
Great, thanks. So we're talking about the expertise as well as the potential financial resources so far. Frank, what do you want to add? Resources needed to sustain data sharing.
Totally agree with both comments that it is a money and an expertise, and you're tapping resources in biostatistics, bioinformatics, data science that are already stretched and rare resources. So it sort of jumps on top of that. But can follow up some of the things I said before. I think we can actually help that problem if we learn to perform better data stewardship from day one when we start an experiment. When it comes to the end, it's a lot easier to share, disclose the information if we've got data that's in good shape, as opposed to pulling it out of file drawers and spreadsheets and trying to put it in a set. So I think, harkening back to what I said before, and there's another. It's a resource, but it's important. You need to have overall commitment from the organization. Otherwise, this tends to be what somebody does as a hobby or on weekends, or it's got to be a main driver or a strategic mission of the organization. That gives people the freedom to do it appropriately.
Great. So I'm also hearing this notion. We think about it in implementation science as well as how do we plan for sustainability? So the things that we're doing on the front end, because we want to see this investment pay off over time as well. At least as I see it. So want to, with these great questions that are coming in from the audience, want to start offering those to our panel. And we'll rely on maybe, because I can see your hands, maybe someone can pop up who wants to join in on this one. So the first question I see is, how can we share valid data that were not collected at the source in an interoperable way? And this is a note about clinical and patient data. So any thoughts about when maybe some of that planning wasn't done up front? Anyone want to take a crack at that one? Great question.
I'm happy to jump in, David. Sure. So I think from our current perspective with the research data sharing, that is exactly what we see. And so we have excellent science that has been funded, and data sharing prior really has been a little bit of an afterthought. It's becoming much more purposeful, but I think, as everyone is well aware, we have historical data, legacy data. It takes a lot of time to analyze these data sets. And so the projects were established long before now. So even incorporating lessons learned back can be difficult. Some of that is, unfortunately, back to the resource question, I think just a manual endeavor. There is a lot of times that we have to pay additional money to have people go back, to have data recollected, patients reconsented, things. And when the benefit is great and we have a large sample and we can really get at a specific answer or question, then we are often able to do that. But I think Frank made an excellent point, and being able to start more at the beginning is definitely key. But for sure, I think we're going to be in this space for years to come, of where we have legacy data, and we're going to just have to figure out how to use it as best we can, while at the same time changing our practices moving forward.
Thanks. Frank or Yili, anything else you want to add on this?
Yeah, I can add on. In our experience, we realized we did our job done in 3 months, but still lots of work. But we feel like, because we use data standards, like we very compliant with CDEX, right? With the CDEX in place, cross studies, we have same data structure, same number of data sets, same name of those data sets, and the same name of data variables, right? So once we figure out the strategy of de-identification, we apply that strategy to each study very easy. Size programs we generate for first study, easily apply to second study, third study, so on and so forth. So I'm even thinking for the future data sharing, our life will be much easier with this plan already in place, right? So data standards is very, very key here. If we could do any clinical trial design, either industry or academia, using standards to collect data, that's a big start point, good start point.
Great, thank you for that. I'm seeing another question, and Frank, maybe we'll start with you on this one. How do you address the argument around intellectual property rights as a reason not to share? How would you counter this as that stated reason getting in the way of data sharing?
Great question. Probably discussed that with well over 100 attorneys. I think, again, it is certainly a legitimate question. Most of the arguments, however, that are put forward are theoretical. So, yeah, somebody might be able to use this or might be able to do that. There are actually very few real examples of the problem. So I think there's certainly some legitimate cases where that makes sense. And by the way, academics make the same argument, all intellectual property is interpreted in different ways. I need this to write a grant or get a fellow promoted or whatever, but it's the same, sort of the same motivation, different currency. And I think it is a great question. And I just think you have to go back and really push the envelope and say, well, give me an example of what that looks like. And frankly, most intellectual property attorneys I've talked to actually don't have any. So I think it's a legitimate, there may be some, and I'm not an attorney, but I think that's often used as an excuse, and I'll use that word deliberately, but I don't know that there's a lot of evidence that's actually ever happened.
Thank you. Jamie or Yili, any thoughts on this one?
I would say when we share data, we are sharing placebo data, right? Meaning in our controlled clinical trials, we share half of it. To me, that's a big protection for our property. That's my personal opinion. So when I get to that level, I feel comfortable to share data. That's the first thing. Second thing, in our shared data, we do have our special data collection. Although those are cancer patient data, but in addition to anti-tumor efficacy outcomes, we collect other kind of efficacy data to address research questions. And then we believe those data are not that relevant to the project of data sharing. So we took them out to protect our company's property. So I think this you have a way to protect company's property, protect IP. That's a fair point. As biometrics team in the company, we are the data steward. We should think that way. We don't want people to get the data can guess these data are from G1 therapeutics. We do not want people to guess that way. So that's something we have to do sensitivity work. We have to do that. We did.
Yeah. So I'm seeing we have about 10 minutes left. So we're going to try and get to as many of the remaining questions as we can. So one question asks, it's evident that culture and language means a lot for this issue. How do you how do you think that, or where the first step is being committed to data sharing? What do you see, if anyone wants to give us a response, what do you see as the biggest hurdle to getting started? So what stands out? What do you feel like is the biggest hurdle to getting committed to data sharing that you've seen among different organizations? Anything come to mind? Really interesting.
I think resources are clearly important. We've highlighted a lot of the issues. I think it's organizational commitment, starting at the top. I mean, does your organization really believe this is important? And I think as an example, trying to change the culture at Duke, we recognize that, if you go through the APT committee, your publications and how many publications you have are important. But we tried to make the point to the dean, who agreed wholeheartedly that actually sharing data is an important academic exercise. So that's not formally a part of the APT criteria. If you share data and you can document other people are using it, that actually contributes to your ability to get promotion or tenure. I don't know how often it actually gets used, but it's a way of, it showed a commitment of the organization to say, yes, data sharing is important and we're going to support. And I do think, and I was fortunate enough to work for, a company where that was important. That's not true at all companies. So, and I do think it gets also to the difference between, do you believe in full transparency or do you just believe in disclosure? I don't believe only giving the placebo group is full transparency. I believe that meets a need. Martin and Bill have heard this argument from me many times, but I think you need to think about, if you really want to be transparent, then that's the commitment of the organization. But I do think that's absolutely essential to get that. Otherwise, you got people in companies or at universities sort of fumbling with each other on the ground, and it's frustrating if they don't think they're getting backing from above.
Thanks for that. I'm seeing another question that just asks, and first person who wants to jump in, what about regulations regarding the sharing of individual participant data? It mentions EU, for instance, is very vague. It's not as easy to know whether it is allowed or not. So any thoughts about the regulatory environment in terms of individual participant data sharing?
Sure. So I think it's been, go ahead, Ely.
Okay, so talking about this de-identification principle, if you do well, you protect patient privacy very well. The point is, you really want to do very well, very thorough. So even whoever want to dig out the patient information, they couldn't. Even they have data in their hand, they play with it. They couldn't identify which patient is this. That's the worry, right? That's the worry.
Jamie, did you want to add anything quickly? Or Frank?
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's important to note that, at least certainly on the research side, and as has been mentioned also many times today, is we have to have that information de-identified. And I do think there are quite responsible ways to share individual level data. We've been at this for some time now with the genomics and having that data in hand as sort of something that we cut our teeth on that is potentially identifiable even when you have access to it. We have rules in place, policies in place. You need to have compliance. And so that more of that carrots and sticks that was also talked about earlier, but there's absolutely ways to do that. And first and foremost, if you do de-identify the data, then you actually have also removed some of those otherwise stated regulations that we've talked about here. And so, and that's again protecting patient privacy. That's come back to that. So if you can de-identify, that's great. GDPR is a whole nother kettle of fish. But what we found, at least in our research programs, is that it's not consistent. And so each sort of individual European state has worked with us in different ways. There are different interpretations, different lawyers. That's something that I think we're still working our way through. But I guess I would say we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And so I certainly would say in cases where data can't be shared because of certain laws, I hope that wouldn't hinder the thought process around what can be shared that is in line with those laws and regulations up into a certain extent. And then those that do it better or more openly maybe can be used in exemplar if there is a better impact and value.
Well, there is, of course, EMA Policy 70, which is a law requiring release of individual patient data. I sit on the EMA advisory board for data sharing. I can tell you, due to Brexit and the pandemic, it's moving at glacial speed. So, but the point about the EMA and GDPR are at odds with each other because they have different views of what is or isn't. So I think that's just something that's going to have to evolve over time. And what's needed is the lawyers that are working on this basically say we need some sort of good housekeeping rules, basically saying, okay, if I do this, then that protects me, because the companies are afraid that the penalty is 4% of your annual turnover. That's a lot of money. So I think there needs to be some sort of rule that sets a precedent when they go to court to say, hey, if I follow these rules, I'm not liable. And that's kind of where they are at the moment.
So realizing we only have a couple minutes left, I want to get to one more question and then give a final opportunity for each person to say anything else they want to highlight here. One question that I see, with the increased availability of shared data, does this increase the risk of data plagiarism? And are there ways in which we can control this risk? Anyone want to jump on that real quick?
I can say it again, in our practice, in our mindset, when we do this, we worry about people use data for wrong purpose. We worry about that, right? Mm-hmm. So many hackers out there nowadays, right? So that's why we spend extraordinary effort, go to very detailed level, even going through validation to make sure the second eye is coming into play. Can you identify this data from G1? The answer should be no. So can you identify any special patients in this study? You can find that country, find that site, locate that patient in the real life. The answer should be no. So the point is, if you do that level of work, it should be safe. Although that effort have to put in to ensure safety. Yes.
I think that's a really hard question and don't have a simple answer. I mean, I think it's hard for, as we know, many examples, hard for reviewers to even spot overt fraud in a data set, to spot whether or not they've actually copied it from somebody. I think that's above, I have to be honest with you, something I had not really thought about. It's a good question.
Yeah, good question. And again, I think it seems like one of the purposes of these symposia are to give us questions to chew on for some time to come. So with the final minute or so, just want to give everybody a chance, and maybe we can go Jamie and then Yuli and then Frank with any final thoughts that you have around sustainability of data sharing efforts, anything else that you said, I wanted to get this in. So here's that final chance. So Jamie, you want to start us with that?
Sure, I'll try to be brief. But I really do want to emphasize my support for what Frank said earlier. I think that if you don't have a commitment to data sharing that starts with the top and is seen through over time, because it can't be a trend in support, because it's a long process. It takes policy changes, it takes compliance, and not everyone's going to be happy about those decisions along the way. I can attest there's a lot of pushback from time to time, but being able to move through that, I think, is going to be really important, and trying to understand that science and medicine is constantly evolving, and that data sharing expectations, the policies, the actual data formatting, the actual repositories, all of those things are actually going to have to be flexible and adaptable. And so if we do want sustainable solutions, not only do we have to have the commitment to doing it, but we have to recognize that this is just a part of the process. This isn't an additional thing or an additional topic. It is science, it is medicine, it is a part of how we are learning and caring for our patients and understanding them. And so building that in, as we said, into each aspect where it's appropriate, I think is going to be critical.
Great, thanks. Yili?
Yeah, I do agree with commitment part. Absolutely. Like in G1, our leadership committed to patient first value, right? So we do our drug and deliver novel treatment for the purpose of patients. For that sake, we also want to support research, medical research, right? Either by academia or by industry. We want to support that. So our data sharing is a physical means to support that notion. And I want to say for us moving forward, it's a mindset change. We know when we do a clinical studies, not just collect data, report the results, we're done there. No, we have continued to deliver the data to be maximized in terms of values, usages. So if we think that way, our mindset changes. So when we do a study, we know that's another task in the end, which is share the data appropriately.
Great, thanks. Frank, final word.
I could just say whatever Jamie said. I think that understand what's best for current and future patients, get commitment from the top, and treat your data commensurate with the value that it cost you to obtain it. So, and if you do that, I think you can help sustain the data sharing, data access.
Great. Well, thanks for that. Thanks to the three of you for such wise comments, and thanks to everybody for the questions. We got to many of them. We apologize for not getting to everyone, but kind of tight timelines. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to help preside over this. So with that, huge applause to our three panelists, and we're going to turn things over to the next really exciting thing, which is a fireside chat, which we love.